Hello and welcome back to Genesis Designs and Modelcraft. Welcome back to even more modelling for beginners, and this is episode 3. And in this episode we're going to get these fuselage halves joined together. Quick glance back at the instructions does show us that there's nothing more to fit to the interior. Everything's in, it's all glued down. So the next step is to glue these halves together, and that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to use super glue to join the parts. I like to use super glue because it's fast, for one. I'm just going to remove the paint from the joining surfaces while I'm waffling about super glue. It's fast. You can get things joined together, sanded, filled and finished in a matter of minutes, and it's permanent. Once your parts are joined together and sanded and filled, that's the end of it. They aren't going to develop ghost seams down the road because the super glue, once it's set, it doesn't continue to react. And liquid cements, all liquid cements actually do remain somewhat plastic. They do move around, and the sort of curing process takes a very long time. So I do prefer to use super glue because ghost seams are very, very much less prevalent when I do use it. It can happen. Super glue, if you're too rough when you're handling the model, you can open seams up and cause kind of micro cracks that can be quite invisible until you put paint on, and then they become very visible. So some care is required once the thing's together, but on the whole, it's a system that works for me. I like the speed and I like the consistency of it, and the fact that when it's done, it's done. So before I go any further, I'll just have a very quick word about super glue, using it, safety and all that kind of stuff. There are many different types of super glue out there, all sorts of glues for all sorts of purposes and all kinds of budgets. Here's just a few of the ones I have at the moment. I would recommend not collecting a massive stash of different bottles of super glue, to be honest, because as soon as you open them and start using them, they do start to degrade, and they're not cheap, so you can end up wasting quite a lot of money if you're not careful. This is just a very, very cheap, no brand, no name sort of super glue. You can get this on Amazon and off eBay, places like that, and it's about half the price of your sort of modelling super glues, really. This one is the AK magnet that we were using in the previous episode, and here I have some from VMS. This is black. I also have the AK Black Widow. Is apparently quite hard to get hold of now, and it's also starting to set up in the bottle. This is the VMS version. It's the same as normal super glue except it's black. This is my favourite, especially when using it for super glue and talc filler, Loctite 495, and this is exceptionally expensive, but it is exceptionally good. About 20 quid for that. These will all be sort of £5 to £7 ish, and these I think are around about £6 for two, or something like that, roughly. I'll put a link to some of them in the finished video. Now, the problem with super glue, and I think the cyano part of the title is probably a bit of a clue, it can be an irritant to a lot of people, and it can become an irritant as well. Even if when you initially start using it, it doesn't cause you any problems, it can build up over time and you'll become sensitized to the chemicals inside the glue. They do have warnings on them. That's the exclamation mark there. So please be careful. If you do find that it's stinging your eyes, or the fumes are upsetting your breathing, then move away from the bench, let the fumes clear, and consider using a mask or having your extractor fan going, or a window open, or a fan or something, just to keep your airspace relatively clear of fumes. When you're doing small things, adding photo etch or stuff like that, you're generally not going to be using enough glue at any one time. I think for the fumes to be an issue unless you are sensitive to them. But when you start to do things like join bigger parts together, you can get enough glue going to have some fumes. So please be careful of that. And I would also encourage experimentation. I know I just said don't buy loads of different super glues, but at the same time, there are so many different types, viscosities, styles of glue. It's worth initially, if you're new to it, trying some different ones, doing some different things, and finding a glue that you're comfortable with using, because it is important to be confident when you're going to use super glue. You have to be able to work quickly and accurately, otherwise you're going to just cause yourself all kinds of bother. So I'm all about encouraging people to try new things and to try to advance their skill set and thus their hobby. So I'm really keen for people to try using superglue for assembly and for filling. But I'm also keen that people don't ruin their work because they tried it on a model that they're working on. If you've never done this before, do consider trying it on some spare pieces before committing to the model on your bench. An ideal way of working through this process on a spare part would be something like have a rattle through the spares box, try and find a drop tank or two or some large bombs, something like that. Just two parts that's simple, go together, and give it a try. Give it a try. If you don't like it, if you can't work fast enough or accurately enough, if you end up gluing yourself to everything, then maybe give it a miss and stick to the liquid cement. But if you find you get on with it, it will probably unlock a whole new side of modelling, and previously unheard of speed and efficiency. So hopefully I've covered off what I need to there. The other point, viscosity. So all of my super glues are what I would call, as you can see, a medium. They're very, very thin. Super glues you can get extra thin that are literally like water. Nor are they the thicker and even the gel type super glues, but the thicker and the gel type super glues could be a way into this for less confident modelers, because they do take a lot longer to set up, so that could be worth a look. I would steer clear for the most part of the very, very thin super glues, because even if you're careful with them, they have a habit of doing what they want, and they will run absolutely everywhere. You'll end up sticking yourself to the model, sticking the model to the bench, and having glue in places that you really didn't want it. So do be careful with the very, very thin super glues if you are going to use them. Right, and with all of that said, I will now glue this together. So I did mention speed and accuracy is paramount with doing this. You do not have much time. Once the glue is in there, and once you introduce the halves to each other, you have very little time to line things up. It's essentially a one-shot deal. Now you can crack them apart, you can crack it apart and try again if you have to, but it will make a mess and you do run the risk of causing damage. So you need to make sure you've test fitted until you're absolutely blue in the face and you're completely happy with the process that's required to get your halves together. With this one, because I added this photo etch shelf in the cockpit, I have to make sure that that's in front of the seat bulkhead when I offer the halves together. If I start at the back, it can get hung up, so that's the little takeaway on that one for me. Alright, I'm going to use the AK stuff just because the spout's in decent condition. This one's it's getting a bit rough now. And I'm going to do this the fastest way. You can make a puddle of glue on a piece of plastic and add it with a stick. I'm just going to put it straight on in a style of tube glue from back in the day. And all I'm going to do, get it coming out, and I'm going to put a nice bead on the entire joint area that I'm dealing with. I want a reasonable amount. I actually want some of this glue to squeeze out. and I want enough on there so that it doesn't go off instantly, which with cocktail stick application is definitely a risk. That's in, bish bosh bash, and that is it. We're done. I'm gonna blink and you'll miss it. Hold the pieces, and that's already basically stuck together. Now I'll get my bit of tissue and quickly just wipe across the joint. I'm just wiping big lumps of excess off. Make sure I'm happy. It's kind of tough if I'm not by now. Good. Top surface is absolutely flush. There's a slight step underneath, but not enough to worry about. And I've got sink marks here as well anyway. So that's it. I've glued the rear parts together. I'm going to use a bit of accelerator now. You don't have to use accelerator, but I like to do it, if nothing else, to avoid sticking to the model so much. There. For accelerator, I do use Deluxe Materials Rocket Blaster. I use this one because it doesn't melt the plastic. A lot of superglue accelerators will soften plastic, so I would advise that they are avoided. If you find that your accelerator does that, then try a different one. Get some of this. This again has the potential to be an irritant, so again, make sure you are happy with it before you use it. As I say, you don't have to. You can employ a modicum of patience instead. Right then, with this super glue around the back here dry enough that I'm not going to stick myself to the model constantly, I'm now going to show you some slightly less terrifying ways of working with the super glue. I'm sure that a lot of you saw that and thought, oh, I probably even did it off camera, I don't even know. Confidence required there, right? So I'm keen for you all to have a go at this, so rather than frighten you away completely and totally just by showing you that, I'm going to show you some slightly easier ways to deal with it, and some ways of dealing with it when you can't necessarily access the parts of the seam the way you might want to. And you can see incidentally here the warpage in the fuselage halves that I've mentioned a few times. It's not an issue because it comes together without any real force and it fits once it's pushed into place. Anyhow, over to the side here, as I've said a few times, it's an old blister pack actually that's taped down to the bench, and I do that because it's out of the way, so I don't constantly rest my hand in it inadvertently and get covered in glue, because let's face it, who hasn't done that over the years when they've had something at the side? So I've got a cocktail stick, nothing special, just an ordinary cocktail stick, and get some glue on the cocktail stick, and because this is spread out like this, I can offer the glue to the seam here from the end of the cocktail stick. Couldn't really be easier, and then I can squeeze the two parts into position like so. Again, the use of accelerator is a long way from mandatory, but clearly speeds up the process for the purposes of what I'm doing here. I like to use the micro brush rather than the sprayer because if you spray it on, it indiscriminately goes everywhere and you do run the risk of damaging your finishes where you don't want to. So that's that together, done. Now moving forward right to the front then, get my glue on my cocktail stick again. I've got plenty of space, I can get in at everything here, it's nice and easy. Plenty of glue inside the joint there, and then again just bring the parts together. And there we go. So that's the upper parts joined. So that only leaves the seam down here, which there is a bit of a gap. You can get into it a little bit, but it's not a great gap. And I could use exactly the same method I've just showed you actually to do this, but I would have to sort of stress the parts away from each other, and that runs the risk of doing exactly what I've just done, which is open up the top seam again. So I'll re-glue the top seam and show you yet a different method for getting some super glue into the joint if access is slightly limited. And I think a lot of you at this point are going to think I've gone absolutely stark raving bonkers, but trust me, there's method in my madness, and I've done this before on larger models where you've got big seams, and this is a small model. There's not much gluing area here to deal with. With larger models and larger gluing areas, think about something like, I don't know, say a B-29 bomber. You've got that great long fuselage seam, or an airliner model, anything like that. There's no way you can put super glue around the whole thing and put it together. It just isn't going to work. There's not enough working time in the super glue to allow that. So you have to do it bit by bit, and when you do it bit by bit, you will always end up with areas that you can't really get at properly, like this down here. And the remedy, as I say, some of you are going to think I've gone nuts. Basically, I'm going to deliberately induce a fault here. I'm going to get just gently, carefully, although truthfully it doesn't really require a lot of care, I'm going to bevel the edge of this seam area. Well, that was satisfying, wasn't it? I'm literally cutting an angle onto the outside, like so. So I've made it have, it's not a gap, but I've made that seam have a seam, frankly. Let's do it to the other side too, so it's easier to see. Not really worried about here. This is inside the air intake. That can be a mess, it doesn't matter. So clearly this is easier if you decide on it as a, if you decide you're going to go down this route beforehand, it's easier to do this while the parts are not joined together. But it's perfectly possible while they are. I'm just making a horrible mess, and I'm doing it on purpose just to prove a point, okay? Right. Look what I've done. I've made a great big seam that now will need to be filled after we're glued together. But the thing is, now I can introduce glue into this joint whether I've got a gap or not. So I'm going to go back to my cocktail stick, if I can find it, or a cocktail stick. Back to my glue. This is the relatively low viscosity super glue. I think technically it's a medium viscosity. You could, this is a situation where the extra thing can work, but I say I tend to steer clear of the very thin super glues. They're a bit of a danger in my opinion. And I say that because I've strongly stuck myself to a model once using it when it followed panel lines and things and ran all the way along the surface of a model, and I ended up firmly sticking myself to it in several places, and I just thought, well, this is silly. And I've never used it since. Okay, now that has not filled that joint that I've made, but it has gone in there more than well enough to firmly glue these parts, firmly and permanently glue these parts together. Nice, okay. Now in the interest of speed, because we're filming, I will again put some accelerator in here and get that first coat of glue set up. Now because you can access the top, arguably you could have glued it from the top anyway, but I'm trying to I'm showing a method here. If you can look in from the top, I'm not sure if I can get the light just right, you can see the shine of the super glue, which just proves that the glue has in fact travelled all the way through that joint. Okay, now I've got a substantial trench here that will need to be filled, and I'm going to use super glue and talc to fill it. So what we're doing here is showing you an super glue, and talc has all of the benefits of super glue, but the addition of the talcum powder just makes it makes the glue into more of a paste-like consistency, and it makes it easier to sand. My talc is just an old bottle of imperial leather. I've got some in a pot here that I use. I think Deluxe Materials actually do a sort of a talc substitute that you can use in the same way as this. Do some testing, find one that works for you. They are not all the same. All super glues don't react the same, and all talcum powders don't react the same. Okay, and if you can't get on with talc, if you're worried about the asbestos risk and things like that, you can just use pure super glue. It works just as well, every bit as good. It's just slightly more difficult to sand. Perfectly possible though. So I've just dumped a load of talc on there. I think it should be sort of visible. Let's move it more to the middle. Yeah! Okay. And I'm just mixing it in. As I say, some combinations of super glue and talc, your talc won't mix in smoothly, and you just have to mess around until you find one that works. This one in particular is that cheap stuff. And you make yourself a little puddle of gloop. And then, I'd imagine you're already there, we're just going to stick that gloop into that seam that we deliberately created. And of course another bonus of using this as a filler is it's still an adhesive, so it will still help to keep this seam together. And you can bridge really some quite large gaps and holes with this stuff. The more talc you put in it, the stiffer the resultant paste, obviously, or the resultant gloop. And if you've got a very small defect you're trying to rectify, then obviously use a little bit less talc so that your gloop is less gloopy. There you go. That is fitted. And now there's not a trench, there's a seam of glue. And I'm going to accelerator it again. And again, use of accelerator is entirely optional. It doesn't take all that long to set up without it. It's quite a rapid process anyway. I'll put that out of the way before I stick my hand to it. Right. Now then, to sand this, you're going to have to use a sanding board. Please don't try and use a sponge. It might work to a degree, but this is quite hard, usually harder than the surrounding plastic. So if you use a sponge, you'll always end up with a bump where the glue is. You have to use a sanding board. Now what you see me using a lot of the time on the channel here is these, because I still have some, but I don't believe these are available any longer. It's the Flory Models Skinny Sander. here's a piece of one here, and you can see it is spongy. There is some sponginess to it. It's not rigid, but it's firm enough. So I'll use now something you can go out and buy if you wish to. Thanks to Premium Hobbies for supplying me with a selection of the absolutely brilliant Infini sanding stuff. Got the sponges and what have you, but these are the right thing to use if you want to sand super glue or anything else that's a bit tough, and get a good result. I'm going to use the one labelled 220. These are the Zebra sanding sticks. Again, similar things are available from other places, and although these are a bit big, you can cut them down. That's what this is. It's just a cut down Zebra type sanding stick. And these are sort of an aluminium oxide type paper bonded to a thick piece of plastic card and a little bit of foam. So they've got a bit to give, but not a lot. And if I start to sand, you can see I'm not sanding the surrounding plastic. I'm only sanding that bead of super glue, which is what I want. I don't want loads of collateral damage, and I will not have loads of collateral damage. Not that there's any detail to damage just here, but it's a good practice. You may have seen me in other videos carving the glue down initially with a scalpel. That's something I do a lot. It just brings it, just takes the a little bit less time to sand it, because obviously there's less there to sand. And that's it. That has got the majority of that bead of super glue and talc gone. I am going to switch back to a skinny sander. This is the coarse and this is the medium. I'm going to go straight in with the coarse side of the medium rather than cutting down my brand new Infini sanders. And this is better because you can more easily see what's going on. And what I'm going to do here is just bring that bead of glue fully level with the surrounding surface of the kit. And then I'm going to flip the stick over to the finer side and I'm literally just going to work my way up through a sort of slightly finer grade so that I am removing the sort of heavy scratching from the rougher sanding board. Use your fingers to check the contour, because you'll feel a flat spot there if you've made one quite happily. And just to show that neat super glue will sand down in the same way. This is just pure super glue. This part will be hidden when the model's complete, but you can see there that. And again, this is the medium grit sanding stick. This is probably about a 320 grit paper. It's just not that bad without any trouble at all. Okay, and once you get to this point, it's time to switch to the sponge sanders. And there I'm going to go in with the 400 grit Infini, and you can see how this can conform to that curvature. So it's going to act to restore the curve as opposed to creating new ones. And all I'm doing is sanding it just enough to remove the previous sanding scratches. so. And then I'm going to go up to the 6, same again. Obviously I'm sanding a much larger area now, and you could say, well, I'm worried about removing detail, but I'm really not doing a lot of damage to the surface that isn't already sanded. What I'm doing is restoring the scratched area. Maybe you can tell, hopefully you can, that is filled, it's smooth, it's a nice, not lost the curve, not gained a new one. It's basically complete. You can go further up the grades. Let's just hit it with the 800. Don't really need to on this model, and I am going to treat the seam anyway. Don't worry about the white areas, you do get those sometimes. And there you go. You could paint straight over that with most model paints and you wouldn't see any scratches. We're not going to in this case, but you could. You can see how little of that panel line's actually been lost. And to finish off this small area, I just need to rescribe the bit that I have lost. Trusty Alpha P800. Get where I can see what I'm doing. I'm not applying much pressure, I'm really just kind of almost drawing. To give myself a map, really, of where to go. And I'll just flip from side to side and just gently run through that a few times, one way or the other, from each direction, and gradually deepen it and reinstate it back to look the same as, or very close to same as, the surrounding kit panel line. And as always, the final step, we only rescribe or scribe, is a little dose of liquid cement of your choice, extra thin or Mr. Cement S in this case. Just paint it along the panel line and it will just soften the edges a little bit and make it look more like the rest of the kit. So there we go, completely glued, filled and sanded in the space of several minutes, and that will not ever be seen again. There is not going to be a ghost seam here. I will treat the rest of the seams in a similar way. I often will use neat super glue where I've glued it like this, because you can see there's a, it needs to be addressed, and it's easier, I find, to get the super glue to really get into those tiny gaps if you apply it before you start sanding, like this. You sort of preemptively fill it in effect. You could argue that I'm creating work for myself here, but I would respond to say that what I'm doing is winning the war. I'm going to have to sand this seam once I'm not going to have to keep on reapplying fillers and resanding, messing about trying to fill tiny cracks. It's a one-hit deal. I'll just accelerate it. And you know, the seam that you thought looked good and you didn't bother filling, it's always the one that you end up having to fix when you start putting paint on, isn't it? This again is the medium grit skinny sander. Hopefully a bit easier for you to see what's going on than if I used the big zebra sticks. As I say, zebra sticks end up looking like this on my bench, so they end up being small enough to use, as you see, like this. It's a good way of using any larger sanding stick or sponge, even skinny sanders, is to cut them down like this, because you always tend to use the end and the middle bit never gets touched. So I cut them down like this, and then as the end wears out I just cut another centimetre off, and then I've effectively got a new sanding stick. They do end up very short eventually, and then you throw them in the bin. The sponge. And done. I'm going to leave it at 400 because I need to do the front and the rear, and obviously I want to see how the cowl fits with it, and I'll probably end up doing some more work here anyway. And that's it. I will continue around the rest of all of these seams in the same way. As a point to note, this here is a moulded plastic representation of a navigation light. I am going to just remove that. It is in the way of doing a nice job on this seam. I'm going to completely remove it, and if I remember, hopefully, I'll replace it with some clear plastic much later in the build. So the upper seam back here and the leading edge of the fin were dealt with in the same way that I showed you here, as indeed was this section here. Already did the nose, so that just leaves this area under the rear fuselage. The back part of this is fine, I've already sanded it, but at the front you may recall I mentioned that I had a little bit of a step. Unsure if it's too obvious there, but essentially this half is sitting higher than this half. This is on me. It was possible to get this smooth and flush, but the way I used Superglue meant that I just smacked it together, and to heck with the consequences. So I do have a step, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how to deal with this. Maybe you can tell I've already, again preemptively, applied a fairly decent bead of Superglue along there. But there's a certain way of dealing with a step like this. It's very easy to end up when you're sanding, you know, sanding, and you're waiting and waiting for the two to level out. And when they ever do, if they ever do, what you are going to end up with is a vastly different shape to the parts than what you began with. So you need to be aware of this and think about the direction when you're sanding, the angles that you're using, to try to minimise that difference. Because in truth, a badly fixed joint, you know, with misshapen or flat spotted, doesn't honestly look a lot better than a joint that isn't fixed at all. And in some instances can be almost more visible. It certainly catches the eye. So with that in mind, I've been sanding just from the high side here, and I'm using the sanding stick at an angle which is encouraging me not to sand here. I'm just taking down the high side. I'm also sanding away from the seam to remove the inevitable edge of the flat spot that's going to be created. And this model, in truth, is a perfect canvas for doing stuff like this because there isn't any surface detail. There's really nothing to worry about. There's plenty of thickness of plastic for this. Not removing panel lines or rivet detail or anything, so and I'm now at the point where really the depth of this super glue is what's showing. So I'm now going to start feeding in, coming across the gap, the seam a bit more. Because obviously I do want to even that, blend that in. There is actually a sink mark both sides at the front here, so I need to do a lot of sanding anyway. You could fill them. But sanding them off is fine too. And since there's no detail to worry about, I'm quite happy to sand them out. So this was neat super glue, there's no talc in this, and this was put on, gosh, it's been on there getting on for 2 days, and it is sanding down perfectly well, even with the finer side, and this is the medium sanding stick still. I'm not using the coarse one. And I'm always favouring the high side. I want to take the height out of the high side. And I'm almost there now. That is looking nice. And just stroking your finger, your thumb across the joint like this. If you've put a flat surface, a facet if you like, into this joint area, you will feel it when you do this. Especially if you train your fingers. Now, I haven't quite blended the glued edge. If you can, I'm trying to. I have a very small screen so I can't tell, but if you just look across that joint, there's a slightly shiny edge you can just pick up on. This is all quite dull because it's sanded, but where you can see a slightly shiny spot in amongst all that sanding, that's a clue, and I'm talking about just here. That's a visual marker that this super glued edge isn't fully feathered into the plastic on the kit, because you can see that little bit of shine still. So I shall reverse the crisscross, just come across from the other direction. And that's got it. And if you look at my cross section as best you can see, I think, quite happily, I have maintained the curve and I've not put any weird shapes into there doing that. The other thing I did was I applied super glue on the front face of the seam just here, and I did that because this area is a seam where the wing part fits. And if you don't fill in the end of the joint like this, you do tend to end up with sort of slight little triangles and what have you, where the end of this seam isn't straight and square, and it becomes obvious when you fit the next part. I also did that here and here for the same reason. Now, because that was a lot of words, and I understand that some people might not be fully cognizant of what I was on about there, I'm going to draw a little diagram. This is not to scale, of my join. So this is one half of my fuselage, and this was the other, and there was a step between the parts here. I applied super glue, which did that. And if I had have simply sanded until that was fed in, my joint would have ended up looking like that, which would have shown under paint. If you sand it down until this is flush, you would end up with a joint that looks like that. So it would go like this, and that's why I'm sanding from the high point towards the low point all the time, but I'm also coming back this way and maintaining the curve just there where I would otherwise have ended up with a corner. If you want to be super critical when you look at a joint where you've done this, you may have a sort of slightly lopsided curve like that, but that won't be visible really from any angle unless you can see it as a direct cross section, which of course when the model is finished you won't. And this sort of work and this kind of thing is absolutely second nature to me. I used to work in the body shop trade when I was younger. Before I joined the Air Force as a technician, I was a painter and panel beater. So this kind of working with shapes and fairing things is absolutely second nature to me. But as I started to sand that part the other day, I suddenly thought it's actually probably not second nature to a lot of people, and isn't probably even all that obvious to a lot of people. So I decided to explain it a little bit. So I apologise if that's been terrifically tedious for some of you, but I think it was potentially worth exploring. And this is, after all, even more modelling for beginners, so there you have it. And this kind of technique is obviously useful with fuselage halves and things like that, but it is even more useful to bear in mind when working with wing leading edges. It's ever so easy to sand a nice big flat into the leading edge of a wing moulding, and I have seen numerous finished built models, even by some quite well regarded modellers, where it's very visible that exact thing has happened. So this technique and this thinking about the shapes and actively making the shape conform, no pun intended, to what you want it to do is really, really useful knowledge, and it's worth practicing. And that is that seam fully dealt with. I just went over it with the sponge, got it nice and smooth, and if use the scalpel just gently to square the joint up in there, and a quick test fit of the wing panel. It's looking quite promising under there. This is a very, very logical point at which to check the fixings here. So this is the hole for the tail wheel, and if you rewind 30 seconds or whatever, you might see that there's a bit of a difference. This is a much bigger and clearly very round hole at this point. Because I did think that hole doesn't look very round, I'm going to check that the tail wheel fits. So I have the kit tail wheel here and also the resin version. And they didn't fit at all. The hole was much too small. So I went up the drill bit sizes one by one, gradually, carefully, widening the hole bit by bit. It's worth doing it that way rather than going straight for a big drill bit, because if you're taking the hole out little by little, you're a lot less likely to grab with the drill bit and end up wrenching your glue joint apart. And I've ended up with a 1.6mm drill bit to get that hole, which gives just a touch of clearance It's not a gap, it fits in easily, and we're done with that one. And at the same time, have a check of this hole here. This is for the retractable aerial thingy, which is part, I think it was C27, and here it is. Make sure that fits in the hole, and as you can see it doesn't. It seems to me, I've just pressed it quite hard on the kit surface, and as a result there is now a white crescent. Do you see? And that shows that this is very, very thin and is in fact probably just a bit of flash. But now is a very good time to be making sure this part fits and doing the necessary trimming. Not when everything's painted and we're doing final assembly and swearing at everything and getting in a mess because stuff won't fit. And there we go. A little bit of flash, clear it out, and that will now fit. Very good time to check things like that before you get to a point where it's going to be much harder to access areas, or you run the risk of damaging paintwork, etc., and causing all manner of heat under collars and such. Last bit of work on the fuselage for now, just to get everything fitted and good, is to fit this cowl. Obviously hoping it's going to work well, and I'm happy to report that in fact it very much does fit well. I found that if you don't push it down firmly, it tends to sort of sit up a bit on one side, slightly tight in here on these. If that bothers you, you can just trim these down a touch, as in use the 15 blade and just scoot it along like that. Just bevel off that top corner a touch, and it will just allow a little bit, a bit more relaxed fit basically here, and it'll just push down just that touch easier. But if you look at that joint, it looks really good here, really good here, but it's a tiny bit tight there, same the other side. So all I'm going to do to alleviate that is using my little sanding board, fit it across the back like this. Literally just a few passes back and forth with the stick, because all I'm doing is just clearing out the slight little, it's not really flash as such, but the edge of these moulded parts is rarely actually completely flat. There's usually a slight lip on one edge, and it's that lip, as slight as it is, that just closes up the fit of that panel just very, very slightly. I'll do that all the way around the part, just carefully. Don't want to take a lot of material off, I just want to level out that mating surface, that's all I'm doing. And as I say, I'll just nip round the whole thing. Doing that. See how little effort I put into that, and hopefully I just need to do a bit more. There's an improvement for absolutely sure. I just need to go a little bit more. You can also see there's a, in the bottom, in this corner is very slightly rounded off, which leads to a slightly aesthetically displeasing joint. And with things like this, it is always better to creep up to the good fit very, very slowly, because it's very easy to do too much and end up with a big gap that you didn't want. So how it's sat now, it's a better fit and a better gap. You see there's a slight angle. It's not quite at the right angle to suit the rest of the kit, so I'm going to use the scalpel now. And again, I'm being very, very careful. I'm literally just taking off the smallest amount possible, but just at this top part. And I'll also just deburr these edges while I've got the knife in my hand. Do you see the little curl of... It's a very minimal amount of plastic, don't panic, but it just makes the joints look better. Same this side, just clear it out a little just towards the top. Like so. And there we go. That's more like what I wanted to see in the first place. It's more consistent with the panel lines around it and will need little or no extra work once glued in place, which I will do now in the normal way, just glue it in with extra thin. Fit at the front, it's, well, do you know what, no, it's fine. It's absolutely fine all the way around, no bother. It's well within the realms of being a separate panel that fits on. It's not absolutely perfect, but that is not necessarily a bad thing. Right, fuselage all done, ready to go, cleaned up, happy with that. There will be more work in the next episode before riveting, but for the purposes of this one, we're done with that. On to the wing then, and I've taken the liberty of doing it one side completely and the other side sort of prepped, so you can see what I've done, but I'm not going to physically show you doing it. I'm not going to physically show myself doing it for time constraint reasons. It's all exactly the same methods that have been shown on the fuselage. So here we go. I started out by going around the joint, and this is a side that I have not yet sanded. And anywhere that had a big overhang or what looked like any small gaps or sort of cracks or anything like that, I've used Superglue and talc. I've chucked some in the pitot tube hole because it was misaligned and looks a little big. That will be completely filled and I will re-drill it to suit the master pitot. I'll probably show that in the next episode. And all the way around, just added super glue and talc to anything that looked like it might need it. Then working my way around, the trailing edges have been thinned. If you look at this one compared to this one, it's subtle, but it is actually a fair bit thinner and comes to a much nicer point. I carried out that with the same sanding stick as before, literally sanding the trailing edge in like so. I didn't do too much underneath because there is a panel line running along the rear edge here, so that A400 go by, which I did not want to completely obliterate, and I didn't. And bear in mind with things like this that there's only so much thickness here, so if you sand too much, that panel line is going to cause problems. Oopsie, sorry about that. And then flipping over and onto the top surface, there is no surface detail to worry about, so obviously you can go a bit harder from the top. And sanding perpendicularly to the trailing edge from the aft edge to the forward edge is literally the way to do it, and just keep working at it, bringing it down, bringing it down. When you get close to the thickness you need, you then sand along the trailing edge just to make sure that it's straight and square, and then finally good old number 11, a very very light bevel to the extreme corners. Now that allows an optical illusion essentially of the thickness of the trailing edge, because it visually looks thinner than it is when you do that, which allows the model to not have razor thin and incredibly fragile trailing edges but look pretty good. Working all the way around, that was done. Leading edges exactly the same as the seams I've shown on the fuselage, just working it around and making sure it stays round. And that has been finished with the 400 grit sponge. The only tricky area is obviously around this raised joint band, this raised sort of joint cover here. I did thin this down some, both with a little bit of sanding and a touch of scraping with the number 15 blade, just bring that detail down a little bit. I think it's a touch overstated as it comes. and making sure that the apertures for the landing lights and things like that have got nice straight square edges. One anomaly I did discover was the presence of this sort of cutout here in the extreme leading edge of the fillet. At first I thought it might be a mould defect of sorts, but it does appear to be somewhat deliberate. I have filled it on this side. I searched through all the photographs I could find and couldn't see any details of this nature on any of the real aircraft I could find photos of that clearly showed this area. It doesn't look like that's supposed to be there, so I have filled it this side. Obviously care required around the front and rear edges where this raised detail is. Just attack it in 3 separate phases. Do the top of this, do this side, and then use the scalpel just to neaten up the actual joint. Just careful use of the scalpel around the edges there, so you don't lose that sort of raised detail across the edges here, because that doesn't look very good. And all of that took a few minutes to explain actually takes quite a long time to achieve. It, as with anything, I sort of sneak up on the final result. I don't go at it too roughly, using relatively fine sanding boards, so I'm not creating massive amounts of damage and deep scratches, and really just finessing everything to get to a nice, neat, finished article. That is going to be it for episode 2. So all of the seams are at this point are dealt with. We're not quite at the stage to start putting the rivet detail on yet. That will be addressed in the next episode, along with finalising these parts prior to doing that, because remember, you don't want to be doing any filling, sanding or rubbing down after the rivets go on. The final thing I did on the wing, which in retrospect I probably should have filmed myself doing but I didn't, I apologise, is I filled the joint here inside this landing lamp aperture. There's a large transparency that goes in there, along with a representation of the landing lamp itself, but there were also large gaps, joins inside there. I used superglue and talc to fill the said large seams, and then I used this is a Mission Models micro chisel, and it's got the larger of the 2 chisel ends in it, and I basically put it in like this and just really gently, with this sort of curving motion that you see me using here, just carefully carved it all back out again. This is not a perfect finish in here, nowhere near, but it's good enough, and it's certainly better than a gaping big gap which would 100% have been visible through the finished transparency. So that was done there. So that is all of these parts, as you see it here, finished with regards to dealing with all of the joint lines using superglue and talc, zebra sanding boards, skinny sanding sticks and foam sanders. All of those techniques have been shown to you here, and again, like the last video, the work involved within this hour of highlights greatly exceeds the time of this video. So again, don't expect this to be finished in 5 minutes flat, and as with so many things in life, preparation is key. Put the effort in now at this point and it will reap dividends throughout the paintwork and finishing of the models. So in the next episode, episode 3, I will finalise a few things on these parts before going ahead with the rivets. So we're going to look at the transparencies on the wings and some of the transparencies for the fuselage. We'll get rid of these bracing bars, address the silly Zeus fastener detail around the cowl, the equally silly fuel filler panel on the wing, and then mark out, measure up and apply the rivet detail to all of these parts. That will all be in episode 3, which will be with you very soon. Again, I hope it has been useful to you, picked up some things or just enjoyed watching the process. Thanks as always for all of your support. I have enjoyed some of the feedback on the previous 2 instalments. It does appear as though people are enjoying the content, and I'll try and keep it up in that vein. So again, thank you very, very much. please consider the buy me a coffee option if you want to support the channel. And with all of that said, I think it only remains for me to say, until next time, look after yourselves, look after each other, and Genesis out.